Okay, and so the objective for today is really having a look at this, what the real environmental damage and pollution going on, but what are the benefits that plastic can actually provide? So it's not that plastics is actually only bad. So at that stage, let's get into some of our speakers today. Next slide. So I'm from the Purpose Business. We're a business based in Hong Kong, and we operate also in the Philippines. We help businesses basically look at doing their environmental strategies. And so it's a case of having Asian businesses be a force for good. Cameron, do you want to tell us a little bit about the school?
Thanks, Maren. Delighted to be here today, and welcome everyone too from Oxford. So I'm the director of the Smith School of Enterprise and Environment, and at the Smith School we're focused on making sure that we understand the challenges and opportunities facing business at the front end, the pointy end of many environmental challenges, be it climate change, food security, water, biodiversity, and also problems like plastics. And we're happy to be here. Next slide. And with me from Oxford, so I'm Professor of Environmental Economics. We also have Professor Charlotte Williams, who's a Professor of Inorganic Chemistry. In many ways, she's the expert here. She can tell you how all the molecules fit together and what the technological opportunities are and are not. And also Norman Ebner, who's a postdoctoral researcher in this project, which is supported by the Oxford Martin School on the future of plastics. Thanks, Maren.
Cool, yeah, and I'm a sustainability advisor with the Purpose Business, and I pretty much start my day in the recycling or rubbish bins and work my way up to the board, looking at ways to make sure waste doesn't get into the recycling bins to start with. So let's get into the actual presentations for today. So the next slide, please. And we're going to get Cameron talking here for about 10 minutes on the context and definitions here. So over to you, Cameron.
Thanks, Maren. So as you can see, and as Maren has said, plastics are fundamental to many fields of human endeavour, and actually they're also required for our sustainable future. They're used in medicine, as we've seen in the last little while. They're absolutely important when you've got a pandemic to manage, but they're also used in energy, in particular clean energy and electronics, and of course, as we go towards a cleaner energy future, an awful lot more of our energy will be delivered through the electricity system. But actually, you find plastics in things like the turbines of a wind farm. So in addition to the usual use of plastics that we all know and love or hate, in packaging, plastics are used across the board. Next slide. But the benefits of plastics come with these fairly bad negative consequences. And many of you probably know, if you're on this webinar, that there has been at least one projection that the weight of plastics in the oceans could exceed the weight of fish by 2050, which is not really where we want to be going. And one of the ways to address this is to think conceptually about moving from our linear system of where you just take the petrochemicals out of the ground, out of the lithosphere, you make the plastics, you use it, then you dispose it and you pollute, to a circular system where we close these loops, where we get our feedstocks from the natural world, either from the atmosphere or from the biosphere, rather than from rocks underground, and we reuse what we make, so that we close the loop and minimize the damage. So moving on, the next slide shows a sense of the scale of the problem. So cumulatively speaking, since 1950, we're at the point now where there's 7 billion tons of plastics that have been produced since that time. And as you can see, it's not a chart that inspires a great deal of confidence. If we move along to the next slide, we can see on an annual basis rather than a cumulative basis. So we're adding to that total of 7 billion at a rate of 300 million tons a year. And you can see how that breaks down by region. And developing Asia has a big role to play in the future of plastics. You see growth from a relatively already significant base there, but growing really very substantially. And of course, Middle East and Africa as well. This is driven by population increases and increases in prosperity. As we get wealthier, we want more of these goods and services that have plastics, at least currently, embedded in them. So moving along, as we take those facts about the future of plastics, its current use and its current problems, and go back a bit to ask ourselves, well, what are plastics? I mean, you probably think you know what they are. I kind of think I know what they are. I'm a chemical engineer, at least 25 years ago, but it's worth digging in because they're a little bit of a slippery concept. So the word plastic has Greek origins from plastikos, meaning capable of being shaped or formed. And the key thing about them is that actually they're an umbrella term to describe a set of polymers of different types. Now, polymer is a substance made up of many mers, and a mer is an individual molecule. And polymers include thermosets, which are plastics that once you've fixed them, they don't move anymore. Thermoplastics, which you can heat, thermo meaning relating to heat, and elastomers, which are actually not really plastics, they're kind of rubbers, but they're part of polymers. And then you can split the thermoplastics up into those two categories you see there, semi-crystalline and amorphous, which depends upon the actual underlying structure within the plastic. So many of the plastics that you use on a day-to-day basis will be thermoplastics under one of those two categories. If we move along, we can see in a little bit more detail how these plastics break up into the sorts of categories that are probably familiar to you from the day-to-day use of them, and just get a sense of the sheer range of functions that plastics provide. So it is a little bit misleading to lump all of these different materials together as plastics, but the bottom line is at the moment they're all based on hydrocarbon chains, so chains with a hydrogen and a carbon atom. At the moment we get those collection of atoms mainly out of the ground from petrochemicals, but we could get them from trees, which actually, you know, the building blocks of nature are hydrogen and carbon atoms with the odd oxygen atom thrown in there as well. Or even in a future world, we could be synthesizing plastics straight out of the air, believe it or not, because this carbon dioxide that is in the air can be captured, and we can use the carbon atoms in that carbon dioxide molecule, and we can take the hydrogen atoms from many sources, but including from water, because of course water is H2O. So there are various ways in the future that we could reimagine this plastic system that give us the variety of different functional forms and uses that we make of the class of plastics today. I think that's it from me, at least for the moment. So I will hand back to you, Maren, after just summarizing the key points, which is that plastics are integral to a modern society, and we not only use them on a day-to-day basis now to minimize food waste, to make our lives more convenient, but they're actually important to a sustainable and a zero carbon future as well. But there's two sides of this coin. The plastic waste problem is very significant. We're currently not on top of it. Cumulative waste is very large. It's getting larger, and we're currently mismanaging those cycles. They're still basically pretty linear and not circular. If nothing changes, then actually we're heading into a worse situation than we're already in, and especially in many Asian countries.
Cool, thanks, Cameron. So just as we're finishing off on those key points, move to the next slide. Do remind you, if you have chat questions, any questions, use the chat box, and let's get questions rolling through there. Some good ones coming in. And the next stage, I'm just going to start talking about some of the challenges. So the next slide, and I'm going to do this section. So as Cameron's mentioned, there's these steady increases in production. We've got this unstable linear production processes going on, and things are accumulating in the environment. But what can we actually do about it? Next slide. Well, it's often seen that the plastics in the environment are where the animals are eating them, or that type of thing. So, but we've got to remember that a lot of the plastic also has different additives to talk about those different forms and functionalities. So those different chemicals or additives can also leach out and cause other toxins. So it's not just the hard part of the plastic, it's what also is in the plastics that can come out. And such things as like PBA free, you might see in our water bottles or that these days. That was one of the additives that was used that's now not so much liked from a health perspective. And when we're talking about the health perspective and impact on the environment, we still are trying to work out what's going on with both the microplastics going into the human body, but also what's happening within the food chain for those different animals, small shrimps, small plants, fish, things. What is actually going on? And it's unknown what's happening with those microscopic pieces of plastics. So there's a lot of things to understand when we say the environmental impacts these days of plastics. It's not just the big bag being eaten by a tube, you might say, even though that is definitely one of the problems we've got to face. Let's move to the next slide. And as many of you all know in this, plastic is not really getting recycled at a high volume. So this diagram is showing the basically 98% of new material coming in. We have these megatons of material being created, and then there's only about, well, somewhere between 14% actually getting into the recycling loop. So that closed loop that we're trying to aim for more now. So we have the problem that incineration gets about 14% of that plastic. Now, the energy that comes out of that incineration may be slightly good, but we're still burning the plastics. Can we use it in a more efficient way? Of course, the big one is 40% goes to landfill, and then there's this 32% leakage into the natural environment. And it's just a reminder here that we've got a long way to improve in these numbers. So let's just move into the next slide. And one of the ways that we do this is roadside recycling collection, curbside collection. This example that we're showing here is from the Hong Kong government. And when you saw in the slide that Cameron was talking about the different types of plastics, those number 1, 2, or 3 through to 7, or those resins, what we've got here is the government has gone out and talked about the shape or the form of the plastic, not actually what is it made of in Hong Kong. So you can have like a PET water bottle, or you can also have, you know, the fruit comes in those clamshells, a bit like a burger box. So those clamshells can also be made out of PET. Based on this direction that the government's gone here in Hong Kong, we get confusion is that clear PET, should it be being put in the roadside recycling bins, or is it only the bottles? So I think one of the things that we have to really look at is the communications of what we mean by what type of plastics we can keep, and how do we avoid contaminating one plastic that looks like it's the same as another, but it has different properties, which causes challenges within the recycling. So next slide, please. And of course, we're sitting here in Hong Kong, and a bit similar in Singapore. They're pretty modern waste management. We're very efficient at getting the waste from the source, whether it's the home or the business, to a landfill or to an incinerator. But as many of you know, across Asia and other parts of the world, the leakage that comes out of municipal waste collection is a big problem. So taking the example here of Metro Manila, Manila has basically 25% of the Philippines waste, but they only have something like 14 million out of 140, or is it 120, sorry, population. So the population is not that big, but we've got this massive percentage of waste. And then when you look at it, waste being generated on a landmass area, it's only 0.2% of the Philippines landmass is generating that 25% of waste. And in those cities, people are collecting things, and when they're moving it from point A to B, it can be blowing off the back of the trolley or blowing off the truck, flowing into a lot of the open waterways that are still part of the Manila system. And then we all know that that wind and water moves it down the streams and out into our oceans. And our challenge is when that water ends up in the oceans. And at that point, I'm going to hand over to Norman to talk a little bit about some of the properties of different plastics.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, one of the key problems with plastic and plastic waste is its low biodegradability, which in essence means that living organisms are not capable of decomposing the material, which means, for example, when we talk about marine species, that a lot of the material either ends up choking those animals, or they die of intestinal blockage, or they are like slowly poisoned by the chemicals leached from or touched to the different plastics. And here it's generally important to make a distinction between biodegradability and bio-based plastics, because very often when those two are confused. So we have got bio-based plastics, which means that plastics are derived from biomass, from renewable biomass, whereas biodegradability means, as already mentioned, the capability of living organisms to decompose the materials by proteins to take them up and process them naturally. And bio-based plastics are not necessarily biodegradable, as can be seen on the chart here. Then, if we can move to the next slide, please. A further problem caused by plastics is the greenhouse gas emissions that are emitted throughout the entire life cycle. So although plastics are very important in lowering greenhouse gas emissions in other areas, for example, in transport, because they just lower the weight of packaging, also of the transport vehicles, for example, cars. Plastics in general have a surprisingly carbon-intense life cycle. The overwhelming majority of the traditional plastic resins come from petroleum, and this requires extraction and distillation. Afterwards, it has to be the respective products have to be produced and transported to market. And even once disposed of, further greenhouse gas emissions will result from the dumping, incineration, or the recycling processes. And the amount of greenhouse gas emissions are so significant that they are probably going to take up a significant part of the overall carbon budget if we do not alter course in the foreseeable future. Then the next slide, please. Thank you. Then one of the major challenges, and as we will see later on, also opportunities will arise from the changing international trade regime in waste. Because ever since the advent of the neoliberal trade policies or trade regime in the world, a lot of the waste that has been produced in the global north has been transported to the global south. So, for example, China has been handling around 50% of the global waste since 1992, and the ban which has been introduced by China 2 years ago, and other similar import or rigorous import restrictions implemented by other countries of the global south, unsurprisingly lead to major challenges and alterations. If you can move to the next slide, please. One of the major problems, of course, will be the displacement of this waste, because many of the Western countries are simply going to transport or sell those materials to countries which often lack the capacities, the capabilities to appropriately handle the plastic waste, which means that there's a high likelihood that a significant part of the material ends up contaminating the environment and the oceans. So next slide, please. So there are specific challenges to the Southeast Asia in general. First of all, very often there's a lack in terms of data about the amount of waste, the type and quality of waste, and the different waste flows. Furthermore, often also the institutional frameworks as well as capabilities are lacking to design, implement, and monitor different programs and policies required to adequately deal with the waste problem. Here we also have problems of coordination, skills, knowledge, because of course, even if a country is capable of building a state-of-the-art incinerator, for example, there's still the problem of the collection of waste, which is a highly decentralized process. And here often many different stakeholders have to be involved for the waste management system to be effective and for the state-of-the-art facility to be effective, to be effectively used. Unfortunately, also when like international organizations like the World Bank or the UN work with the countries on various projects, it is very often the case that they fail to build up the necessary human capital to cultivate those changes and projects for the very long run, so that they can self-sustain once those international organizations and their staff have left. Further, factors that have to be considered, of course, like what's the awareness, what's the interest in solving the plastic waste issue, because this also depends upon the income of the different social strata. Because in the end, very poor people might be less interested about plastic waste. For many of them, it might even form a source of income in like extra legal markets. And there's also the linked cultural attitudes and habits, because there's usually a certain stigma attached to waste and to handling of waste. And in certain societies, only certain strata of the population would actually be permitted to handle the waste. And all of those issues have to be considered if we want to build sustainable waste management systems. And many of the like different social elements, like scavengers, those have to be part of the solution and should not be left out by simply top-down solutions which are imported from Western countries.
Cool.
Then I hand over. Yeah. Thank you.
Excellent. Next slide, please. And so just quick key summary points there before we move on to Charlotte. Plastics are not the problem. Of course, it's how we make, use, and dispose or incorrectly dispose of them. And as we talked about the linear production systems before, and getting into this fun of what are the actual technical solutions around biodegradability, as well as different institutional frameworks. So handing over now to Charlotte for the next slide, please. And another 5 minutes, Charlotte, and it's cool to hear some of the opportunities from the chemist side of things.
Okay, thank you, Maren. So it's fair to say that in 5 minutes, I cannot cover every potential technical opportunity. And the other point that I want to make is that I'm just going to highlight some areas of technical interest at the minute. But we're not going to be able to solve this problem with technology alone. We clearly need a multi-pronged approach to the problem. So if I can go to the next slide, I'll highlight the first of the 4 areas that I want to talk about. Upcycling is an opportunity where you take waste plastics and convert them into something else that may have even higher value than the waste material that you're starting with. There are some already examples of this working. So you break down the plastics, the polymer chains, into value-added materials. It's a bit different to recycling, which we'll cover in the next slide, or reuse. So in terms of upcycling innovation, some of the things that we've seen in this area are taking recycled plastics, for example, polyolefins, and upcycling them into waxes and additives and recycled chemicals. Now, of course, this is a nascent stage operation, and there are still many technical improvements to be made here, but it also needs careful examination to see what happens to those end products that are made from the polymers. We also see at the research stage really exciting opportunities to take material like polyethylene terephthalate and re-engineer it into other substances, for example, materials for use in building and construction, but also in water purification. So upcycling is definitely an opportunity to get some value from the waste materials and to take advantage of their valuable chemical structures. If we can go on to the next slide, please. There is also an opportunity to break a little bit the link with the petrochemical sourcing of many plastics. And the most important point to make here is that at the moment, the vast majority of plastics are made from petrochemicals. And so they are absolutely entangled with the petrochemical industry as a material, as Cameron had said earlier on in the presentation. At the moment, about 1 to 2% of all the plastics come from a different raw material sourcing, and that is a biomass sourcing. And at the moment, that's predominantly sugarcane. But in future, there is a lot of research to see how we can better use natural wastes, natural co-products, so that we can extract valuable biochemicals from those materials and transform those into plastics. Now, there are a couple of reasons why this might be an interesting research area. The first is that, as I've said, you get that benefit of the plant taking in the carbon dioxide when it grows. Of course, we need careful life cycle analysis to make sure that the emissions are reduced when you make this type of plastic, and it's not a uniform case that all plant-based materials will give you lower emissions. But this is certainly an opportunity to break that link with CO2 emitting petrochemical processes. Another opportunity here is that because you're installing those biochemical linkages, you sometimes bring into those polymers the properties that make them easier to recycle and easier to biodegrade. Clearly, this is a fine balance between getting the properties you need in the plastic material, and remember that their widespread uses is all about their properties. They deliver very useful properties. They're very easy to process, and easy means low temperature conditions compared to alternative materials. So by using some of these natural and bio-based raw materials, we can bring into those polymers properties that make them easier to recycle and in some cases degrade. If we can now go on to the next slide, please. So I've said that at the minute it's still a really nascent industry. It's quite a small industry. As I said, about 2 million tons, and if you compare that to the total global production of plastics, it's a very small fraction. But what's important to realize about this opportunity is that it is growing, and it's particularly growing in Southeast Asia, where we can see that the bulk of production is happening, but there are also very significant efforts in Europe and the Americas. So that brings me, I think, to the close, Marion, of my part. I'm going to go on to the next slide, please. And talk about recycling technologies. Of course, this is a very important area for optimization of the technology options. Materials like polyethylene terephthalate, PET, can already be recycled in some circumstances, and we need to increase and improve those recycling technologies. There are opportunities both to allow for more mechanical recycling of polymers, but this often leads to a compromise in their properties. You often reduce slightly the quality of the material after you've been through a mechanical recycling process. And so people are also looking at chemical recycling processes, and this means where you break that polymer, that plastic, back down into its constituent raw materials, and then you can use those again to make a new material that has much better properties, has similar properties to the material you began from, if not the same properties. And so there is many opportunities for research in this area, both in improving mechanical recycling, particularly of mixed plastic waste, so that you can get materials and objects out of those recycling streams that are higher value, and in chemical recycling to be able to really have lots of loops where the material is used and then reaches the end of its useful lifetime, is fully recycled back to its raw materials, and you keep those molecules in play. You're not wasting materials, you're not throwing away things that could be usefully remade back into product. And so there are key questions here that the research community are addressing. How can we increase the selectivity and activity of current recycling processes? How can we make them more effective and more efficient? And for example, there are very important questions to consider when new plastics are coming into this mixture as well, to make sure that they integrate properly with existing recycling streams and that they don't interfere with those processes. So at this point, I want to hand on, please, to the next slide and hand back over for the end of my part of the presentation. It's now going to be the business opportunities for plastics. Thank you.
Thanks, Charlotte. Over to you, Norman. Fire away.
Thank you. Thank you, Charlotte. Thank you, Marion. So now new business opportunities might be found in the changing world of plastics with the new materials, the new development in various technologies, not only recycling technologies, but also like big data, artificial intelligence, which actually might be useful in tracing down the different waste streams with better data, better insights, give us a better understanding of the behavior of people, the use of products, their disposal, and therefore also inform our understanding of their behavior and give us insights into how this behavior might be changed. So if we move to the next slide, please. No, I think it was the previous one. Yes, thank you. So of course, this transition to a more like circular economy or to a new plastics economy will require an appropriate mix of regulatory measures and certain market measures. And those will be required to incentivize and to coordinate the transition. Like one important aspect will certainly be some form of extended producer responsibility. Those are schemes with like a kind of philosophy behind certain schemes which have been implemented in various countries, which actually force the producers to internalize the entire environmental costs associated with a product throughout its life cycle. So they have got every incentive to cut down on the environmental costs they're imposing upon society. Then there might also be important market players like asset management companies who adopt socially and environmentally responsible investing principles that might force major corporations to make changes to their product designs and their corporate governance in that respect. And of course, it will be very challenging to figure out an appropriate mix of those strategies and to develop a strategy which kind of provides the optimal solution to the system, which leaves everyone better off, but at the same time avoiding any rent-seeking behavior. But of course, those types of solutions will have to be tailored to the individual countries in question, and they have to take into account the various social, economical, political aspects, as well as previously mentioned the cultural understanding, the cultural aspects of waste and waste management. So if we can move to the next slide, please. Then, as previously mentioned, there are major changes in the international trade regime when it comes to waste, particularly plastic waste. And there might be opportunities arising here. For example, now it becomes more and more difficult and more costly for like Western countries or countries of the global North to export the plastic problem to the global South. Those countries actually have a higher incentive to invest in their own recycling industries and to develop internal markets for recycling products. This might lead to like opportunities for like Asian countries or other developing countries, because in the end, the plastic waste that does end up in those countries might be of a higher quality and therefore of a higher economic value and impose less social and environmental costs. Further, certain recycled products they might be able to export back to those countries of the global North. Further, certain import taxes might provide them with the necessary funding to finance the construction of their own infrastructure with regard to waste management. Of course, all of it comes eventually down to their ability to enforce those bans and regulations, because like in international trade issues, it always depends, of course, upon the political leverage that the individual country has or that the individual region has. So these are issues that have to be investigated further so that the different countries can reap all of the benefits that they can, while we move toward a more sustainable system, a more sustainable economic system in plastics. Then if you can move to the next slide, please. So now when it comes to business models, those have to be tailored to reap all of the benefits that derive from the different changes, new opportunities, technological developments that we have heard of, and many others. So We have to understand that new plastic materials are being developed, that new developments are underway in the technology sector, particularly with regard to artificial intelligence, with big data, which will provide us with different tools also for the bottom-up policies to alter the behavior of the consumer, but also to better monitor trade waste and waste streams globally. And so those new business models had to try to live with those new realities and try to spot the opportunities which will benefit them. Then I hand back to Marion. Thank you very much.
Cool, thank you, Norman. All right, next slide. And what we've got in this next section of the slides are coming up, we'll move through these quite quickly so we can get into the Q&A after a few more slides. But a couple of case studies the purpose business did. Next slide, please, Anna. Working with different companies in sectors. So one of them is the aviation, and the short version of this is, great thing about plastics, they're nice and lightweight. Which then reduces the impact of flying planes higher in atmosphere with CO2, and that type of thing. How do we balance that back down with the waste that comes out the other end? What are the other options? Biofuel from the plastics going back into the fuel for the planes. Next slide, please. We've also been lucky to work both at music events and sporting events like the Rugby Sevens, and the key point to pick up from this one in Hong Kong, we were very lucky to have the government strongly supporting the rugby union. And that's what's highlighted in this photo. You had the Undersecretary for Environment really wanting to use a big sporting event to try and test things out. Each year they kept on adding something, more and more to how they did the recycling, waste reduction. And so then we've got to the stage where the participants are starting to really realise that they can be part of it. We went from single-use plastic cups last year to washable cups. Now, for some in the call, that might sound like, well, that's been happening in the world for ages. But we have, that's a big step in Hong Kong at least, because that's the first time with 40,000 people in a stadium that we've had washable cups. Next slide, please. And then the other industry that, the third industry we'll talk about is hospitality. And this whole thing about sustainable luxury and working with hotel chains right the way through what is something that's needed and what is something that has just been added in the past. And the discussion about what's a good in terms of putting a plastic straw in a really nice drink, through to other things like when you look at the back office recycling options, what happens locally in that community when you've got a chain of properties across the world with very different recycling industries at the local. So in this case, Hong Kong, China, Europe, and the Philippines. So how do you have policies and standards that actually are applicable for all the bases you operate? So next slide, please. So the key points of that is basically what we've heard from the last two speakers themselves in this area is what are the new materials that we can find and how do they operate and what are those business models? Now let's quickly move into Cameron because Cameron's got some things to share in the next set of slides about calls to action questions. Back with you, Cameron.
I do, thanks, Marion. And quickly is the word because we've got 9 minutes left and want to do some Q&A. So first, moving on to the next slide, what we wanted to do, what Oxford was here for, is that we are trying to get to grips with some of these big questions from not only the chemistry and the physical scientific side of things, but also the economics, the regulatory dimensions, and the legal dimensions. And we wanted to put this on with the purpose business partly to reach out to you and say, if you're interested in these areas and you think you want to get involved, you might be able to help us. We don't have all the answers here. I mean, Oxford is in principle consistently ranked the best university in the world, but I think those of us inside it can barely believe that. And we know that we actually need to reach out to everybody else to hoover up the knowledge and the partnerships that is necessary to actually have an impact. The second point, just a quick one, is that at the Smith School, we do a number of executive education programs on big issues. We don't yet have a plastics exec ed program. We could be doing one. So partly it's a question about whether there's interest in that amongst this group, because if there's not in this group, there's probably not, full stop. And then, I mean, in a moment, I'll hand back to Maren to talk about, knowing your plastics and what you can do. But if we go on to the next slide first, just to elaborate a little bit more on what some of the big questions are that we're looking at. So, and I see this in the chat, and thank you everybody. It was really high quality chats there, really good questions. So thank you. But are we actually pricing things properly throughout the chain? So if you look at the life cycle, you look across, from feedstock all the way through to production and waste management. I think an awful lot of the problems come here because we don't, the private sector doesn't have the right incentives, the right signals. And partly that is about the regulatory structure, the policy, and the economics. So that's a core part of what we're doing. Then on the international side of things, as Norman has alluded to, we've got this big trade in plastic waste that has started to break down. Was it the right thing in the first place? Do we have the right international legal frameworks? We've got a brilliant professor of international law working on the problem too. And then again, a feature that's emerged in the chat a lot, how do we move away from petrochemical feedstocks, given that we're not going to be using gas and oil so much for energy? Is there a risk that they all end up piling into plastics and we have super cheap fossil plastics overwhelming all of us? Instead, perhaps we need a bit more of a portfolio of inputs into this production, some bio, some petrochemical, possibly in due course, maybe it's a bit more speculative, but we could even make plastics out of the air, take the CO2 out of the air, combine it with hydrogen from water and make your hydrocarbon chains that way. And then the final question, obviously in bio, we've touched on this already, but we need things, or we want some of the plastics that we use to biodegrade, but we need them to biodegrade at the right timescale. You don't want your bottle of water, which you probably shouldn't be having in a plastic bottle anyway. But if you're having a plastic bottle of water, you don't want it to degrade in your hands. You want it to be fine for the period of use and then to degrade afterwards. So next slide, and I think that's actually it from me.
Yep, thank you, Cameron. So quickly, from the perspectives of summarising a few things, way that we Pivot's business basically suggests to people is know your plastics, and as you've heard, it's about what are the different polymers and where they come from, and what is their performance at the end. Understand the scope of each standard too. Just because it says it's compostable plastics, understand whether that means in commercial composting, what temperature, all of those types of things. Definitely look at what's the options in your local area, what are the recycling options that'll work for you guys, and watch the cross-contamination of both between plastic types and plastic and other resource types. So next slide, please. We work with this diagram with our clients to kind of just make sure we go through the whole range of thinking or different perspectives, whether it's production, consumption, disposal, collection, all those loops in that. This is all available on the website, like the case studies for the TTV. So let's move to the next slide, which is basically the final summary. And as you read these, and I'll read them out, start making sure you've got key questions in, and we've got a couple ready to go. Banning all single plastics isn't the solution, is what we're saying. We have to use plastics responsibly. We need to understand their types and recyclability. We need to keep it up to date. Now, I think we will move into the first question now. And who's this question going to be for? Rebecca, type questions here. So the question is, what is the business case for organizations that produce plastics for moving to a circular economy and show economic value of the transition from a linear to circular? And that's going to be for what, Cameron, in a 2 minute one? Cameron is there. Did you hear that enough?
Here I am, Maren. Challenges going from linear to circular.
Yeah, so business case for going from moving circular economy to show the economic value of that transition.
Yeah, so there's been a bit of chat in the side on this too. And part of the challenge, I think, is that at the moment, the incentive structures are kind of, in a way, lining us up for a linear system rather than a circular system. So actually, properly pricing environmental damage would help. Properly pricing actually all of the life cycle impacts would help. But then this is not just about government. In fact, it's not primarily about government. It's actually primarily about the private sector, businesses and consumers take a bit of a lead, and consumers saying, I'm willing to, I want this. I'm going to choose that kind of circular product as opposed to a linear product, and businesses, in a sense, creating the demand. So there was a question earlier on the chat, to what degree actually have oil companies, in a sense, I'm paraphrasing, been responsible for creating the desire for plastics? And, it is part of the story, but perhaps now a set of leading businesses could create the demand for circular products. And then provided we, consumers, respond, then we'll start to get the whole thing scaling up.
And I think that's coming through. That's coming through with our purchasing, isn't it?
Okay.
By asking for recycled content within purchasing requirements, or getting materials that have some reused components and reducing the demand version part. Okay, I'm just having a quick look at, we've got another quick question is, with all this fun going on around the coronavirus things and all the personal protective equipment, are we hearing anything that's really good to be done for recycling recovering of this material? I'm not sure if this is a Charlotte question or not. Oh, she's being very quiet. If she's
it may well be, but I think she, like me, unfortunately, we have to go. So
I'm sorry, I have to.
Let's do the wrap up then, because we've got all these chats. We'll be recording the chats and being able to continue the discussion after with other follow-ups. So I just want to thank everyone that has participated today. We'll go to the next slide, please. Thank you for all these interesting chats. It's really been great that Cameron's been able to share a number of answers quickly in there. It's great that the two organisations have come together. There's a few people that have done a lot of work in the background to make this happen. Feel free to reach out via these different social media platforms that are listed on the slide for follow-up questions. And there will be an email sent out to everyone with a link to the materials from today. And so we will leave the, we'll finish the recording shortly, I believe, Anna, and we can keep the chat box open for another 5 or 10 minutes just as people dump their last thoughts or questions there. Thanks for everyone coming along today. And we'll call it officially finished for now. Thank you.